for the second time. I'm a happy returnee to this country. The danger of speaking after lunchtime is always the same, is that you might send people to sleep after the delicious meal that we have. But first of all, I would like to thank the organizers on my behalf and on behalf of CEDEFOP for inviting us to be here and to show our work and also our perspectives. First of all, I should start by explaining for the ones who don't know what CEDEFOP is and what we have been doing in this area. So the reason why we get these invitations every once in a while. We are a European agency. We're one of the oldest European agencies in the European Union. And we have been researching and discussing the issue of career guidance, in our terminology, lifelong guidance, for a long time. So we participated in the OECD reviews, but we have kept, let's say, a consistent interest in the area. So we never broke really interest, so we kept researching on many topics during all these years, and in a way which is also consistent with the widening of the scope of our whole work. We started by being an agency dedicated to vocational training, but in the meanwhile we have become an agency which deals with lifelong learning in its full scope, with employability, with the way the labor market functions. So we look into all these aspects. I liked very much the presentations in the morning. I found the presentation from Professor Sultana thought-provoking as usual, and I would start by saying something a bit related to what he said. I mean, I'm going to talk more about the policy dimension, not so much the practice or the theory, but there's something that he said that stuck with me, which is this idea that we must be careful with this neoliberal approach and all of this. And to a large extent, I agree with many things that he said, but I have something which I believe is complementary to these observations, which is, at the same time, we must be careful with how we define objectives for policy or the outcomes of guidance activity. We must nevertheless set goals which can create national commitments. And this is what we have seen from observing processes and documenting processes in many countries. And I'm going to just quote two examples before I start going more into the presentation. For example, in Ireland, there is a big national dialogue at the moment to decide how do you establish agreed outcomes for career development support services, how they should look like, how they are meaningful for every stakeholder involved in the process, including the people who are benefiting from the service. So this is a dialogue that in a way must be held and crystallized. So this is also the nature of what guidance is in policy. Another observation which I found interesting is that we had a meeting in Brussels with a number of people from across Europe. And we were talking precisely about the idea of how do you make policy a tenet in, or how do you make guidance a tenet in policies? How do you make sure that it's always there with the quality it should be? And we ended up arriving to the conclusion that we must say something about its purpose, its aims, and this must be always clarified or transparent in policy strategies. Someone said otherwise, having or not having guidance or career education, for all that matters, becomes a matter of belief of whoever is in power. So, just as a small introduction. Now, essentially what I'm going to talk about is about challenges and opportunities which many countries are currently confronted with in terms of development of both guidance activities and career education. I'm going to talk a bit about current trends which we have identified across countries, and I will, let's say, dedicate a bit longer to trends that we have identified in career education, since there is a special interest, let's say, in this during this conference. We're also going to look into what are the tensions which, let's say, configure the panorama, the policy panorama in the near future, and then land on a few conclusions. We have, of course, when we're talking about different countries, quite a diverse world. We have countries which have completely distinct demography, so they can have an aged population, which is a common European issue, for example, or they can have a very young population, for example. We have also distinct economic situations, which include different patterns of specialization, which include the existence of financial crisis or financial health, so a number of issues like that. We also have very distinct institutional makeups, and we also have a wide variation in terms of cultures and values which are underlined by these cultures. So this fundamentally means that there isn't a single solution which works for everyone. So career development support must necessarily account for these differences, and there needs to be adjustment in the systems which are chosen to address this diversity. Nevertheless, there are challenges which are more or less felt at the moment by everyone across the world. There is clearly an automation and digitalization of workplaces and also of learning activities. So this is affecting a lot, or this is transforming occupations, it's transforming sectors, it's transforming organization of work. So it also represents new information, new data to take into account when providing advice, counseling, etc. We also have a continuing and growing globalization of production and of trade, which also creates changes in occupational profiles and the way people relate at work, relate with clients, etc., which once again affects what the profession is providing to people that go to trying to find, to clarify their options. We also have a growing new economy. We have new patterns of self-employment. We have a typical activity of many individuals. We have a growth of platform economy, of gigs, etc. So we have an emerging work logic to which it has been documented that guidance doesn't have a clear response yet, so there's still not a standard response to many of these issues. And also growing, we have mass migrations. This is especially important in Western countries, but its effect, the movement of people is increasing a bit all over the world. And it's a movement both of economic migrants, so people in search of work, pure and simple, or a better life, and also humanitarian migrants, which include all the asylum seekers and refugees, which creates also a very specific new pressure over guidance services. In large parts of the world also, in countries in development especially, tends to be a low market participation of women. We also have large shares of the market which are informal, which consist of informal activities, non-declared activities. In many places, there isn't even a guidance service to talk about, so it's still, the structure still needs to be established. And on top of all of this, generally, you can't just take one solution and use it somewhere else, so you need a cultural adaptation of techniques, of methods and tools which have been successful elsewhere. So this is also an important component. So we must not only think about the world which is settled. So there are also other aspects which are not clearly, let's say, opportunities or challenges. They are both in one way or the other. Multi-channeling, so this old digital revolution is, of course, changing things. On one hand, we know that digital technologies bring the opportunity to have more flexible services, have a different offer, especially in terms of career information, but also other types of activities. But this also represents a challenge for the practitioners and for the services themselves, and requires a development of a certain type of skills and a certain type of attitudes, which may create strain on the services and the systems which are put into place. Also, there is a tendency, I'm going to talk a bit more about that, for the growth of a more holistic and networked service. This is, of course, a great opportunity for development, but again, it also implies that the services have to be able to train the practitioners in the skills that they need, and not all national services are capacitated to do this. There's also a turn of community capacitation, so an attention to local services and to the increase of capacity in terms of, in regional terms, in local terms. I'll also talk a bit more about this, but this represents also a challenge for local and regional stakeholders, which are normally not engaged in this type of policy. Another thing which is not clear is the emergence of career development in business environments. There is, of course, staff management and human resources management can be largely enriched by the introduction of certain methods and tools which are characteristic from guidance, but this, once again, represents a great challenge. Most growth policies and countries do not account for this, and a lot of enterprises are really not necessarily ready to revise the way they do things, especially small and medium enterprises. On the other hand, we also have let's say the growth of labor market information. At the moment, there are large amounts of information available, for example, skills forecasts, information related to jobs, so to job vacancies, for example. But the way, has been mentioned before, to integrate this into guidance and career education is not necessarily clear. So this represents another challenge. So now to just make it a bit clear, so what is trending? What we have been doing is to take advantage of the fact that we are in direct contact with a number of national authorities on permanent contact, and we tend to monitor what is happening, especially inside of the European Union, but also in some other countries. And we do it fundamentally through a network called CareersNet, which has experts from every country. They provide us information. We analyze the information of all countries. And one of the exercises we do is to extract some trends in terms of what's happening, what's changing in national systems. One thing which emerged as a clear current trend pertains to coordination and quality assurance. One important thing that we have observed is that we know that there is a division in national environments of responsibilities, for example, across education, employment, or other sectors. So certain sectors are very strong and they control the activities inside of those sectors. Very frequently, these policies are not very well coordinated. One recommendation from the past was to create national forums, for example, from the OECD reviews, to try to put these policy environments into contact and create a strong coordination across services. What we have verified in the meanwhile, since these recommendations happened, is that these forums have worked in a few countries and in some other countries not. So in the ones in which they have worked, there has been strong engagement. There was strong bottom-up dynamics and strong engagement from employers and social partners, let's say, in the process. There was also very strong political commitment from the top. So you had a bit of a sandwich keeping the forum alive. On the other hand, in other countries where the forums didn't exactly survive, there was nevertheless some emergence of coordination, but coordination mechanisms came not directly from the guidance sector. So the most common cases we've seen is that the employment sector has taken over and created the national coordination of relevant stakeholders, administrative and not, towards an integrated policy, or the lifelong learning policy or national strategy, when there is one, has created a framework for the coordination of services. So this is a very interesting dynamic, and at the moment it's becoming very strong and very pronounced in a number of countries. So for example, the OECD is doing these reviews on national skill strategies, etc., and this is also becoming a bit visible through those reviews. Another thing we verified is that the local and regional dimension in terms of coordination is growing. So what is local stakeholders? There's a realization that, let's say, both educational and training and employment policies become a reality at the local level. So what's happening even in very centralized systems is that local stakeholders are becoming key in terms of implementation at the operational level. And they end up taking a lot of decisions which influence deeply how career development support is done in reality. So this is a clear dynamic. Another issue now relating to quality assurance and evaluation is that let's say in these 20 years, the evolution is very weak in terms of quality assurance, the monitoring, and evaluation. So there are many countries which still don't have clear standards, so what Ronald was mentioning. And even more, the monitoring and evaluation is almost inexistent. Monitoring, when it exists, is merely in terms of outputs. Now we can discuss if we make quantitative, qualitative indicators, so this is completely an open discussion, but the need for standards and some type of reading on what works, how it works, when it works, is important, needs to be part, let's say, of policy culture. Another trend, big trend, has to do with guidance and career learning activities in general becoming closer to communities and closer to people. So one thing which is clearly happening is that these sort of regional or local spaces where a lot of local stakeholders come together, provide information, learning activities to people, show the reality of jobs. So you have employers, you can have representatives of social security, you can have representatives of schools and training centers, etc. Gathered together under the same roof, coordinating activities is growing. So this is appearing in a lot of countries. In different ways, depends on the institutional makeup of the country, but this is growing. Another thing which is somehow connected is that there is also a growth of an active service, guidance service linked to outreach activities. So that more and more there is the logic that guidance should be linked to activities that go to people that are far to reach, both young and adults, that may be outside the coverage of standard policies. But this creates also an enormous pressure because most of the practitioners do not have training in outreach. So ideally this is a great development, but it creates also very large challenges. Also another thing which is clearly growing is the services to refugees. Once again, very interesting development, but most guidance services are not prepared to respond to this. There's a lot of knowledge, that practitioners need to have on legal frameworks, administrative frameworks, etc. They need to coordinate with a number of services, and so all this needs to be, let's say, wired inside of the systems. Another thing which is happening, another big trend, has to do with the growth of career education, fundamentally. We have growth of career learning in general, and of career education specifically in the educational sector, a bit for all age groups and in terms of all levels of education. So one very clear and new trend is the integration of career guidance in career education for adults and adult education and adult learning. This is happening in a very expressive way. It's not only light coordination, but in many cases there's actual integration between the services. So for example, you can have an integration between services which do validation of skills, do guidance, and which provide or let's say send people to work-based learning solutions. This represents a huge challenge because these services tend to speak different languages. They have a different understanding of outcomes. They have different understandings about many things, and this is when having a national framework that rationalizes these relationships becomes important. But this is a very wide topic. I'm just sort of talking a little bit about it. Also, another thing which is happening at the same time is that there is a growth of all these mechanisms linked to the individual choice in terms of which service to access and how to access it. It can have a more liberal tone, a less liberal tone, but the fact is that these vouchers, these individual accounts, are growing a bit everywhere. In some cases, they're more regulated. Let's say I'm remembering the French case, which is the individual learning account, which is associated with an individual guidance process, if people want to do it. And this is an example of a strongly regulated one. And you have a less regulated one, for example, in Belgium, in Flanders, which they're using a more market-oriented voucher, but nevertheless trying to assure the quality at the level of the provision. So several solutions. And of course, this is very linked to the emergence of the use of personal portfolios, because this allows that individual information, the individual processes carried across providers, different services, and to a certain extent, ownership by the individual of all this information. Now, career education, more in the more usual sense, is being developed. I just brought a few examples from countries that we have relatively well documented. One example of an early intervention is this at Beroepenhuis. I'm not sure my Flemish is very good, but essentially this is an intervention in which students aged 11 to 14 can have contact with the reality of professions which were deemed to be bottleneck professions, so professions which need people and will have likely, in which vacancies are likely to emerge, and which are considered professions of future. So this is not a brainwash to children. So it's a very pedagogic approach with a lot of care put into it. But it's a very clever thing. This was done as an alliance between an NGO, the educational system, and the chambers of industry and commerce. So there is a smart use of labor market information, a financing of the sampling and the simulations which are put into these activities, and a clever integration of the information in both classroom activities, let's say activities outside the classroom in schools, so that there is, let's say, a nice way to bring children into the world of work. For example, in this image, what they're looking into is what a harbor manager does in his daily work. So it's a growing occupation, and they have a simplified, let's say, a simplified version of what a harbor manager has to deal with. Another example from a different level comes from career education in Finland. I mean, Finnish have been clear leaders in a lot of important aspects. They have reformed their career education, which is compulsory. So there is embedded career education in grades 1 to 6. There are 76 hours all through the other grades. The obligation 76 hours of activities. These activities have variations, so there's not a rigid way in which they are made. So let's say the regional forums which they established have the capacity to affect the way in which career education is developed in the schools of the region, and there is an understanding at regional level on what is going to be done. So, but they are quite a good example of strong coordination. There is combined with these educational activities a flexible and individualized and fully adapted career guidance support. This also coexists with work experience periods in cooperation with local employers. And also relevantly, it is also not only being integrated in education, but also in vocational training, which is currently being reformed. It's quite an impressive process, and I think one worth following with some attention. Another example comes from higher education from France, in which they developed, of course, extended their traditional approach of portfolios, in which they have so much experience. Of course, the portfolio is just a superficial aspect of what the work that they're developing in higher education. It's essentially, let's say, the face of the whole approach. But what you have is several networks of universities which essentially have tried to integrate career learning in the later stages of higher education. So when people start to think about which occupation they're going to have, they're finishing their degree. Essentially what happens currently in France is that they select a teacher who's also a researcher, and with some training and tutoring and mentorship to work together with the students, so to explore their curriculum, the existing, labor market solutions that exist for him, and try to adapt this later part of curricular development to what is their target in terms of career. So this means that they work a bit on every level. They work on the technical level, on the theoretical level. They work also in terms of development of relevant career management skills that people should have when entering the labor market, and adapted specifically to the contexts which are their targets. These teachers also support the students in networking activities to then be able to integrate those environments. And all of this is, of course, supported by the portfolio tool that, as I said, it's the face, but there's the whole process behind it. All the training modules which are used to develop these skills relevant for the career are developed in cooperation between the universities that are engaged in the networks. Another thing is, of course, the trends which are emerging in terms of technology and labor market intelligence. As I said, there's this growth of multi-channel services. It's important to say that, that there's a bit more than this. What we have seen is that you can have really several models of how you use digital technologies, being that the most desirable is that you have a service that is flexible and adaptable to the user's needs, so that you can use, let's say, information online with some people, you can use chat services with some other people, you can use phone services, and you can combine all of these channels in different ways to address the needs of each person, and also escalate the service actually to face-to-face service whenever necessary. Also, so we have some successful examples at this level. We also have some terrible examples of how to use digital technologies. Another thing which is also important is the clever use of labor market intelligence. One thing is assuring that it is really high quality. This is happening in some countries. Avoiding the dispersion, this information dump, and creating, let's say, single points of access which are easy to digest by practitioners and that they can use quickly and in a relevant fashion during their work. And we have several examples in which this is happening. It's one of the positive tendencies in the UK. There are good things still happening in the UK. Another aspect which is emerging is, of course, these blended methodologies, which really are the essence of this flexible approach, because ideally you should be able to choose the blend which is adequate for each person. This is very parallel to what is happening in lifelong learning. I mean, it's in the same way we have a learning process, if you can use it very well. What is very interesting is that this, of course, brings a certain revolution for the way things are done in certain sectors. It certainly brings to education, because you you really pull away from this input model and the front-feeding model of information, and you need to have active learning necessarily with this. So, for example, I remember that Tristan Hooley has some interesting ideas on how to introduce this in educational environments. Another revolution, this represents a revolution also for business, because which I think will motivate a lot entrepreneurs, because this gives the opportunity to stimulate career learning processes which will benefit simultaneously enterprises and workers, and without disturbing too much enterprise activity. So this is, I think we're going to hear a lot about this in the years to come. Now, and also encourage social responsible business, which is quite important. Another thing which is happening is that we have, of course, this revolution in terms of artificial intelligence, machine learning. We discussed this thoroughly in the last meeting of this network of CareersNet, and I mean, the conclusion was, okay, it's exciting, a lot of things are happening, but it seems to be essentially relevant for career information. What people reasoned was that guidance must remain on essence a human service, and it's very hard that artificial intelligence replaces the human role. Nevertheless, let's wait and see what happens. Now, just to quickly go through this, what essentially the tension that we currently have can be described by these two scenarios. One I call Back to the Future, another one New Hope, which are, of course, names of films which are well known. New Hope is the first Star Wars film. And what is interesting is that we are now building up ideas in this time of change, you know, the globalization, technology, the fluid societies, of what guidance should do, what career education should do. And essentially there are two positions you can think about. One is to stick with an idea about this future which got a few things right, but essentially is quite antiquated. You know, and you have the overboard and all of that. Or you have the other option, which is the New Hope option, in which you know that this enormous change is happening, there is a revolution happening, and so you take charge of it and you take responsibility, which is pretty much what happens with the characters of New Hope. So in a quick way, what you have a role that was thought over when in policy, guidance started to be taken more seriously. That guidance could be essentially something that responded to an idea of what jobs would look like, so the forecasts, the skills forecasts. You could then use guidance to match people with these jobs, and you could use technology to replace practitioners, and people would have this self-directed processes with websites and etc. In the scenario of New Hope, there's a bit of a different idea. You have intelligence, not just forecasts, so you have a lot of sources of information. People should explore it autonomously, and this is what should be encouraged, so autonomous citizens. It's a service not oriented necessarily for the matching or purely for the matching, but for the support of careers of people along the life course and for the sustainability of businesses, which is a very different idea. And also, let's say, an activity that makes a smart use of technology instead of being a victim of it. In very practical terms, it also means a move in terms of this type of scenario from a service that can be provided by almost anyone, so it's not to a service which has universal access and it's fully professionalized. Also, it's a service that is not instrumentalized like a bad placement service, but rather a flexible support all through the life course. And it's also a service which, instead of just looking at matching, tries to balance business, personal welfare, etc. So, to conclude, I will conclude not in very conclusive conclusions, but rather in important discussions for the future in terms of policy decisions. So first discussion is, should guidance be an entitlement? Should it be a right? So this is currently on the table in many countries. There are many voices talking about against, for, etc. There are many points to look at. But more and more there seems to be a convergence that guidance should be considered an essential social and economic right. So it's essential for learning. It's essentially to be successful in the labor market, so along these lines. Also, to be contemporary, it must be an integrated component of digital citizenship. So if you have e-government policies, if you have digital citizenship, the career dimension must be integrated into it. And also, a permanent tenet. Should it not be a permanent tenet in all relevant policies? The lifelong learning policy, the educational policy, labor market policy. So these are serious discussions to be held at national level. Second, innovation. Innovation is great, but it has to be very consistent. And it has to be relevant. Essentially, this means that innovation takes the activities to the context. So it takes the career learning, no matter in which format, to the workplaces. It takes it to communities. It's part of community development. It goes in a relevant fashion to school, and it integrates well with school activities. And it goes to home. It goes to the individual environment, to the personal environment. So people are capacitated also wherever they might be. Another thing is that you need a correct use of digital technology, which means, for example, if you introduce digital technologies, you must somehow have a professionalized service behind it. You need to choose tools which are adequate to the needs. So there's a number of issues here which need to be thought through. Another discussion to be held is the promotion of blended methodologies. So this is probably interesting to just add as a chapter in government programs in several areas. So this is something to also discuss and to think about. Another important discussion to be held is how do you, so the holistic services are desirable, but how do you actually get to them? So in a way you need to assure that you have a coordination between relevant stakeholders, all relevant stakeholders across ministries and levels of administration to achieve successful services. You need to make sure that the professionals are trained in all the right areas to get to these services. And also, you need to have a national discussion in terms of how you orient yourself to quality and to desirable outcomes. First of all, you need to even select which outcomes these might be. So, just very quickly to finish. As I said, we have this network in CEDEFOP, which is a good example, I think, of a regional, in world terms, of a regional network, because it promotes this ideas or this exchange of ideas on how you should monitor the processes and evaluate them, the systems, exchange information between all these relevant practices and how you adapt them, and also to inform the creation of policy strategies and of a number of other relevant documents. So I think that the creation and the participation in these networks, especially the ones which are in your geographical and political context, are very important. Finally, there is currently an interesting dynamic, which is a certain convergence of views between all the international organizations about this role that guidance and career education should play in all relevant policy fields. With CEDEFOP, the European Training Foundation, ILO, UNESCO, OECD, and the European Commission have just recently released, let's say, a leaflet which has a statement, at least in the area of adult learning, of how guidance should look like, or what should preside, the principles which should preside its existence. And of course, in turn, a very large principles linked to decent work, work-life balance, the existence of an holistic service, etc. This is a start. I think this is a very important step, an important message at international level regarding the growth and importance of career guidance. I think more is to follow, so I expect. So maybe I'll have the opportunity to eventually come back here and talk about whatever is going to happen next. So thank you for your time.